Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar on how to write plain language summaries and ways to get press attention with your abstracts. Thanks so much for attending. And as Shing mentioned earlier, if at any point during the webinar you have questions, please just type them into the question box and we'll either write you an answer during the webinar or we'll get to them at the end when we have time for questions. So who's talking to you today? I'm Olivia Ambrosia. I'm in Sharing Science at AGU. You'll be hearing from Shane, who's also in Sharing Science, and from Lauren and Liza, who are in our Public Information Office, which is essentially AGU's press office for promoting the science in the AGU journal. So AGU's Sharing Science program that I just mentioned is its mission is to support scientists like you who are interested in communicating to broader audiences and to provide you with the skills, the confidence, and the opportunities you need in order to be able to communicate about your science and its value to virtually anyone. And we do this through a variety of ways, webinars like this, for example, but also workshops, some of which you can request through your institution. We travel to different locations, a lot of online resources that you should check out. And then also we try to offer hands-on support and support at our various conferences, especially at Fall Meeting where we have a lot of programs. So I want to start, this is really valuable for whether you're writing a typical scientific abstract or a plain language summary. But let's talk about it a little bit more in the context of a plain language summary, thinking about your audience. So first and foremost, plain language summaries are the more generally accessible version of whatever kind of scientific abstract you're writing. And when you're writing your abstract, and especially if you're writing a plain language summary, you want to think about who you want to be talking to about your science and whom you're hoping is going to read about. So obviously you're trying to talk to other scientists, but presumably you want to also connect with journalists about your science or let them know about it, and either indirectly through the journalists or directly talk to the non-scientist public. So how do you actually connect with those audiences? Don't do this. This is a cartoon that I drew a while ago, and it is representative of my own experiences early on in my graduate career when I was so thrilled about my science and didn't understand why everyone else was not either, and just wanted to pursue them until I could convince them to be as interested as I was. That is not a good technique. We tend to be so steeped in our own research that we don't realize how much we need to spell out for other audiences. So for example, if you study hurricane behavior, you want to talk explicitly about the value that that provides for people in terms of protecting against winds, protecting their businesses and homes, protecting against flooding, helping with the development of new building planning after some storm surge events. If you're talking about snowpack, you want to put it in the context of something like skiing, tourism, or what the effects will be on water resources and whether there will be a drought situation in it. If you're talking about heat waves, you want to connect it to people's concerns about heat stroke or about their electricity bills from AC. And if you're talking about phenology shifts as a result of climate change, for example, then you also want to connect that to things people care about. What are crops going to look like? What are garden plants going to look like? What diseases are people going to have to worry about because the vectors for them have changed ranges as a result of the change in climate? And when you're talking to journalists, and Lauren and Liza are going to talk about this more, so I won't belabor this now, but we do have a handy-dandy guide to give you a sense of what sorts of results in a study are going to strike journalists as more newsworthy than others and are going to be more likely to be highlighted by them. So you can find this on sharingscience.agu.org, and it's also in one of the handouts that if you look among the various little gray boxes on the side of your screen, it's one of the handouts that we offer you there too. So you can use that as a reference as well, just to get a sense of what kinds of results are going to catch a journalist's eye. And for scientists themselves, now presumably your typical abstract is, as well as a plain language summary, is also intended for scientists. But obviously, there are so many scientists who are outside of your own field of study. Speaking as a biologist by training, when I started working in AGU, I had no idea what many of you did. And it's only through getting people to help explain their science in a way that is not field specific that I've been able to understand it and understand what's so important about it. So bear that in mind too. You might need to change how you present something just to get potential collaborators to understand the value of your work. And one of the ways you want to do that to connect with any of these audiences, especially in the plain language summary, is to speak the same language. This doesn't mean you want to dumb anything down, but it means you want to use clear language, you want to put issues in context, you don't want to get bogged down in details, and you want to avoid jargon as much as humanly possible. Because jargon really is just serving as a barrier between you and your intended audience. If it's someone outside of your specific field of study, they are not going to know at least some of the words that you are using that are more technical. So if you can avoid as much as possible those extremely technical terms, unnecessarily long words, excessive acronyms, especially ones that you don't spell out, and words with multiple meanings, that's going to really help make these plain language summaries more accessible and understandable to others. And words with multiple meanings, these are some examples. Some of these can probably be figured out from context, but just be aware that if someone who's not in your field is reading a plain language summary about your work, they might have a different immediate association than you do. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're explaining whatever you're explaining. And with that, Shane's going to give you a few messaging tips.
All right, thanks, Olivia. So when thinking about a plain language summary, obviously it's going to be a variation of whatever your abstract is. So this is an example actually that Olivia wrote up. So there are a few data on Crassostraya virginica physiological rates across the range of salinities and temperatures to which they are regularly exposed. This limits the applicability of growth and production models using these data. Now, this is something like I understand this. I know what this is saying, but it's not the most accessible things, and that's just by nature. That's what scientific abstracts are, and that's fine because the audience is usually very technical. But when thinking about putting this in a plain language context, it's important to go kind of above and beyond just replacing words, using words that are just more readily understandable or accessible. It's important to think about like what is the abstract actually trying to say. So a better version of this, for a plain language perspective, is if we want to effectively predict the growth and health of commercially important eastern oysters, we need to know how their physiology changes in habitats that have different salt and oxygen concentrations. And even with this is much more accessible and much more probably like attractive to a reader. But even something like this, Olivia and I were talking earlier, could probably use a little bit more finessing as well. Things like physiology, like not everyone might not know what that means. But this is a really great improvement from the more scientifically technical and jargony abstract. It's really important to think about, so what it's about, obviously, but what did you find? What is your actual message trying to get across? So this is a title for an AGU pub, quantifying the daily economic impact of extreme space weather due to failure in electricity transmission infrastructure. We actually have a plain language, but a headline for this publication. So what is the study actually talking about? Well, it's talking about money, and it's talking about the effects of solar storms. And solar storm blackout could cost the U.S. $42 billion per day. Same study, same science, just this is really getting to the heart of the finding. Like, this is exactly what the study was about. This is that last line. Like, what do you want people to take away from this? Another really important to think about is, why does it matter? And this isn't necessarily like you need to justify why you're doing your science. But the science that you're doing might not be not everyone might appreciate it as much as you appreciate it. So it's really about just making people care about it as much as you do. If you're really excited about this, you're doing it for a reason. Why would other people care about it? Maybe it's health or money or kids' future or education, security, whatever it might be. So thinking about these things, just pulling back and thinking about what's your study about and what do you want your abstract to convey are really good kind of core first steps in thinking about, all right, then what am I going to write? How am I going to write it? And when you do this, it's important to test it. Like have someone you write this plain language summary, have someone who's maybe not a scientist, or maybe someone just not even in your field. We get so bogged down in the technical jargon of our field that it's difficult sometimes for even scientists who are in one field over from us to understand what's going on. And so like this is not the reaction you want. Like again, I could probably understand a lot of abstracts that I'm reading, but maybe not as much as I could if there was just a few, like if the message was just slightly different or slightly more accessible. And it's important to kind of take time to do it right. It might, like a plain language summary might generate a wider notice than, probably will generate wider notice than your just normal abstract will. It can be really helpful for journalists. Lauren Liza will talk about this. It can be helpful for just even people in your field. Like they're probably reading a boatload of abstracts at any given point, and if they read one that's very clear, very to the point, and they understand exactly what they're saying or what you're saying, then that can be really helpful. And it's really important to think about the plain language summary before you write your entire manuscript. Too often, and when I was a researcher, I am guilty of this as well, the plain language abstract or plain language summary was an afterthought. I'll figure that out later. But it's important to think about this as you're doing it, because that way you can think about what the study is about, why it matters, why people should care, and it could be a core part of your manuscript or your talk or whatever it might be, rather than just a tack on at the end. And so if you're looking for some examples, and if you are on Twitter, or you can just search for these on Twitter, we do kind of a roundup of just some publications coming out of AGU and some what we think are decent examples via this size summary hashtag. And so there's one talking about sea levels in Antarctica and the ice sheets, talking about atmospheric conditions and sea level with changing wind conditions, things such as coral reefs and thermal stress, and talking about a warming ocean. We do a lot of climate change work here at AGU. Talking about wildfires and how sunlight and evaporation are going to have effects on wildfires. And then just one talking about volcano, kind of like what happens after one eruption and how it's going to affect further eruption. So these are just a small smattering, and we cover the whole broad swath of AGU sciences. So if you are interested in looking at examples, or if you publish a manuscript with us and you want to, you have a plain language summary, there's a potential that we could feature it. So you can just even tag us on Twitter, and we will talk more about how to connect with us at the very end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren and Liza, who are going to talk more specifically about, catching our reporters.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I'm Lauren, and I'm here with Liza Lester, my colleague, and we work in the AGU Public Information Office, which is basically the press office for all of AGU science. So our job is to, throughout the year, publicize the newsworthy research that's published in our journals, and we also publicize the newsworthy presentations that are made at AGU meetings. And the biggest one is obviously our fall meeting. So something you may not realize is that there are many people besides other scientists and your colleagues who are looking through the abstracts that are submitted to our meetings, specifically fall meeting. So there are many reporters and press offices who are also looking through those abstracts. And so every year at fall meeting, we have about 250 to 300 members of the press who come to our meeting, and they come to cover all the wonderful, amazing new science that's being presented there. And so through that process, they are looking through the abstracts to look for things that they might want to write about or cover for their stories, whether they be written or multimedia. So the types of media that come to our meeting, there's anything from straight general reporters to bloggers, other press officers of your own research institutions and societies, filmmakers, photo and video journalists, even journalism students and faculty come as well. And so our job in the AGU press office is to comb through all the abstracts that have been submitted to our meeting, to the fall meeting specifically, and to help reporters cover those amazing new discoveries by planning a series of press conferences where we have researchers come and give short presentations specifically to the press, talking about their findings. We also will make up lists of what we call tip sheets of potentially newsworthy presentations that reporters might be interested in. And this is just to help them cover the meeting because it's so large. We really want to give them a hand in finding newsworthy, interesting science to write about. So I'm going to turn it over to Liza now, who's going to talk a little bit more about what we look for and what reporters look for when they're covering science.
Hi, everyone. So the first thing is to say that your work can be important and not newsworthy. And so we're not trying to say that something is not important, but for it to be newsworthy, it has to be new, not an incremental advance. Something that is a breakthrough, it needs to advance your field significantly. And it helps if that has an impact on people in a way they can understand, or at least is really curious and interesting or unusual. If it changes the current thinking on your topic, that's always going to be great. And if you have multimedia that can illustrate the things that you've learned, that's just so helpful to getting a story across. So things that might not be newsworthy, if it's already been reported, then the news is over. And if it's summarizing something that's already been done in your field, if it's a review article, that's probably not news anymore. Or if it's confirming a previous result, that's important, but it's also not news. So when we're looking for fall meeting abstracts, we're looking for things that are new, that are related to things that might be also going on in the news. Maybe if there's a volcano erupting or if there are fires happening. We want it to be significant. If it's strange, that always catches our eye. It needs to be important to people. So easy things are health, but it could be something more abstract that's just, there's space could still be important to people. We're looking for things like the biggest, the largest, the deepest, the most. Those are always going to be exciting to people. And if it can touch on a lot of different things, that also gives reporters a lot of angles to come at the story from.
So so this is just a couple of examples of some past press conferences that we've done, just to give you an example of the kinds of things we typically will publicize. So the first on the left is from 2017. This was a press conference on how climate change has had unexpected consequences for populations of different animal species. So just two sample presentations from this press conference. One was how changing snow conditions in Alaska and Canada were affecting Dall sheep, which are important commercially. And then another one about how beavers are now colonizing the tundra in Arctic Alaska, which had never been documented before. Another one we do every year, like Liza said, we do a lot of climate change related research. Every year, NOAA puts on the annual Arctic report card because climate change is affecting the Arctic right now more than any other area on Earth. They do kind of a status update of state of the Arctic. What is the latest research on how climate change is affecting the Arctic and what's going on? Now, this isn't the only kind of topics we cover. This is just a sample. And we've also just to, Liza mentioned some things that are maybe a little bit odd or different or unusual, things not necessarily having huge impact like climate change, but things that might be of interest to reporters for their stories. Here's a couple just examples of presentations. For example, we've done, this was from last year in 2018, we did a press conference talking about caribou migrations and how those have been changed over time. Things that relate to new research on Neanderthals. And Neanderthals are always kind of capturing the imagination of people these days because they're, our closest relatives, but they're now extinct. So, the story of the Neanderthals is really interesting. So this was a new piece of research on the diet of Neanderthals. The third one on the right is actually about ancient fossil plants that were studied in Antarctica back when Antarctica was ice-free. So that was interesting because it's kind of counterintuitive and goes back to this time in the past where Antarctica was like very different. And what we can learn about that is maybe what will happen to Antarctica in a warming world if more of the ice were to melt. And so now that you have a kind of an idea of what we look for when we look through all the abstracts, if you think that, you looked at our criteria that we look for, and you think that your results might fit into that if they might be newsworthy, how can you let us know about it? How can you catch our eye so that when we're searching through these abstracts, we'll see it? Well, there's many different ways. There's a couple different ways you can do it. First is to make, when you're writing your abstract, be really clear. And we're kind of just echoing everything that Shane and Olivia have said so far. Use all those great tips that they told you about. Thinking about your audience, avoiding jargon, focusing on your messaging and what the value of your science is and what it means. So what we really like to see is, really be clear in your abstract. What is the context? Basically, what is the research question that you are trying to answer? Why are you doing this study in the first place? Why does it matter? Then talk about what you did, your methods. Then what you found, so that's your result, and be as specific as possible if you can. If you have specific numbers, put those in there. If you found that, a certain ice sheet has lost 40% of its mass, put that in there. And then talk about, like Shane and Olivia said, why your results are significant. Why do they matter? Put those numbers, give them a little bit of context. Of course, the implications. What does this mean? How does this affect people? What is the take-home message here? What is the thing that you want people to remember? So, be really clear in your abstract, all these different parts. Again, you can write a plain language summary, as Shane and Olivia talked about. That was really helpful for us. That really helps us really kind of hone in on things. And so if you've listened to our presentation so far and you think, well, you know what, I still want to write my abstract, just for my scientific colleagues, that's okay. You can choose your own adventure. But if you could also write a plain language summary for the broader audience, for us, for reporters, that would be great. And you can do that, and then your abstract will still be the scientific abstract that you want. Again, use clear, simple language whenever possible. Focus on the meaning rather than the detail. So what does all of this mean? So a really good example that I heard once in a presentation was, imagine if you're walking down the street late at night and you see a rabid dog. Not that those are very common anymore, but let's say you were to happen to see a rabid dog and you stop and you're staring at this dog and he's growling at you and snarling. Your first thought is not, okay, let me count the number of teeth in this dog's mouth. Let me see exactly how many feet or meters this dog is away from me. Your first thought is this dog going to bite me? So it's really the meaning behind all of those details. What is going to happen here? And of course, the easiest thing to do, and we definitely encourage you to do this, is to contact us. I'm sure if you think you might have a newsworthy abstract, if you just want to know more about this, absolutely contact us, let us know. We're happy to talk to you about it. Our general email is just news@agu.org. So one other ways, as Eliza mentioned this earlier too, to catch our eye is mention if you have any visuals or multimedia that help illustrate your research. And you can, of course, include them with your abstract. That is definitely allowed during AGU meetings. Any sound you might have, infrasound, whether it's video, any photos or images or GIFs that really help illustrate your research are great. And then you can also use keywords that really help draw attention to. They really provide context and draw attention to what is new or significant about your study. So for example, if you have new results, say that they're new. If you've seen something for the first time ever, say that. If something was previously unknown and now you figured it out, say that as well. If something about your study is unexpected or counterintuitive or unusual or surprising in some way, use those words and tell us, give us that context. It helps us understand where your results fit in with the rest of the research in the field and why it might be significant and different. Like Liza mentioned, if there's a superlative, if you found something that's the biggest, the oldest, the youngest, etc., all of that, say that as well. Or if there's anything about your research that might be provocative in some way, if it refers to something famous, a famous historical event, a landmark, a current event, if there's anything controversial or contrary or overlooked, definitely mention that as well. And I do want to just mention one caveat. We're not saying that you should necessarily overhype your results. We definitely don't want you to do that. But if you really do think that your results are, do fit into one of these categories, just be clear about it and let us know. And as Shane mentioned earlier, write your title as a statement of your results, not necessarily the question that you were trying to answer. So kind of the format of like X did Y or X found Y. So here's a couple of examples. So for example, the first, of reduction in rainy days during summer exacerbates Western U.S. forest fire extent. That's very clear. That is what they found. Ocean warming drives increased mass loss at this glacier in Northeast Greenland. This causes this. That is the result. That's what they found. The third one, historical warming has about tripled global populations annually exposed to extreme events. Again, very clear what they found. All right, and now we're going to go through some examples. Now I'm going to switch it over to Liza.
All right, so Lauren and I have put together some examples from past meetings, and there's a lot of words on these. We're going to kind of point out the things we think are the salient features, and if you want to come back and read them in more detail, these slides are going to be available. So this is an example of a great plain language summary because it's short and it tells us what they did, the type of data that they used. It tells us why we might care about it because it's something about why Earth was habitable, and then also might tell us about why other planets might be habitable. And so it's really summarizing in one sentence what they did, why it's important, and why you might be interested. And it's clear about what might be new.
So here's some examples of, some implications that were very well stated in abstract. So the bold is the title of the abstract, and then the quoted part is the actual implication. And so these are, I'm not going to read through all these. You guys can go back on your own. But just really good examples of where the implications were really clear of like why this matters, how this affects people, and why we should care.
So keywords, like we said before, this is telling us presenting an oldest record, or something is surprising, or something is unexpected. And those words are going to jump out at us when we're reading this, especially if you put them towards the top of your abstract. Don't bury the lead. Remember that we and your colleagues may be looking through 26,000 abstracts, and you don't want to be overlooked.
So here's an example of a really well-written title and abstract, and like we said, you can go ahead and read this in detail later, but the blue parts are really the salient parts. So the title, Unexpected Observation of Subglacial Methane to the Atmosphere, that's really clear that like they found something that was unexpected, and the blue parts, we can tell, okay, until now, direct emissions of this have not been proved. So we know that like they're showing something for the first time. They show, in the second paragraph, they actually give you the actual concentrations that they measured and that how much higher they were than the background. And so that gives us the really needed context to understand how significant this finding is. And again, the third paragraph, they use great keywords. They show, they say our unexpected and striking measurements show for the first time this observation. And so that really helps us jump out at us and helps us hone in on the significance of this finding. So again, the title is written as a statement of the results. Great. The research question is clear. The context is clear. It's super easy to understand what they did and what they found, and the significance of the results are also obvious.
So another well-written abstract, how Uranus fell over. That is both funny but also meaningful. It tells us something that might be interesting about the planet Uranus if we don't know anything about it and fell over somehow, and maybe this is a consequence of a big impact. That's kind of interesting. And it immediately tells us what they did. Oh, it's kind of a modeling study, but it still sounds like it might be interesting. They're telling us why their modeling study could be relevant. This is more on the curiosity angle, I guess, for the broader impact. And they tell us exactly what their new results are. So that they have new simulations that might have produced something new. But they also did a plain language summary, which is even better because it's telling us really clearly what their abstract is about. And it has this fun picture that's very colorful and eye-catching. They kind of got everything in there. They have a title that's interesting, and it tells us what it's about. It's clear what they did. It's clear what the context is. Its plain language summary is there to help us understand it. And the significance are also obvious.
Here's another eye-catching abstract that we found, and this one is a little bit different because it's not necessarily the keywords that jumped out at us, but the topic, and then the way it was written really made it clear that this was interesting. So this is about tornado genesis, so it's about tornado formation, and so the abstract is actually a little bit wordy in my opinion, but it flows well, and it's really clear what they did and what they found and how those results are interesting. And so what they actually found in this research study was that historically, people have thought tornadoes form from the top down, but actually they form from the ground up. And so basically it shows here that that traditional hypothesis of tornadoes starting from the cloud and moving downward is likely incorrect. So she really lays out here like how their result is contrary to what was previously assumed in the field, and that's what made it interesting to us. So like I said, the language isn't as clear as we would like, but we can still understand what they did, what they found, why it's significant, and what the implications are.
All right, this one, once again, has a great title. It's telling us what it's about. We already may know that microplastics sound like pollution, and you would have to know what the Hadal trenches are, but a lot of people are going to guess that might have to do with the deep ocean. They're also wrote this in a way that, while it's still somewhat technical, like flows and you can understand what it's about, they don't bury the lead. It's clear that what they found was that these microplastics are getting into the deep ocean floor. It tells us why they're bad and why that might be surprising and what the broader implications are, why this is going to be a problem. So they're hitting all these things.
So now we're going to show you some examples of things that are maybe the opposite end of the spectrum, things that are really hard, abstracts that were really difficult to untangle and understand what the significance was and what the results were. So this abstract we found very vague and confusing. And it's actually confusing because the title is really interesting and eye-catching, and the title seems like it is a statement of their results. Climate warming causes carbon-rich permafrost in Siberia to degrade. Okay, so it sounds like that's the result that they found. But then when we dig into this abstract a little further, it's actually unclear what they did. Like the problem is laid out, the context and the research question, but nowhere does it say, in this study we did this, we found this. So we have no idea what was actually done here. Like the title's well written, they've laid out the question and the implications of the research itself, but there's no mention of what they actually did, if they actually performed a study, what the new result is that they found. Like for all we know, this could be a review study, which is fine, of course, it's very scientifically important, but there's no mention of that whatsoever. So we have no idea what's going on here with this piece of research.
This is another one that's a little confusing. It's telling us something somewhat straightforward in the title. Penguins is proxies for the past climate. That sounds interesting. Maybe the second half of it, we're not quite sure what this penguin colonization is or why that matters, but at least we kind of have an idea of what it's about. And then the first sentence is kicking us off by telling us that penguins are a proxy for these certain conditions, but it doesn't tell us why we care about those conditions. It also has some interesting jargon, carcinogenic soils. After looking at it for a while, you might think, do they mean penguin poop? I think they do mean penguin poop. Maybe go ahead and say something like that. You could still use the word orthogenic, but mix it in there so it's clear what you are telling us without me having to read it multiple times, because I might not do that. It's also telling us that there may be a really young occupation. That sounds like it might be unusual, but they're not really drawing that connection for us, so we're not sure if that's really an unusual thing. But it also is telling us that they have the oldest record of penguin colonization, and so that's kind of intriguing. So it's kind of a mixed bag. The title is reasonably clear. We know what they did. They stated the results clearly, but we're not quite sure what the implications are or why we should care about it.
All right. Well, so hopefully there were some things you can pull out here of ways to write your plain language summaries or just your normal abstract that can help whether you're doing a manuscript or a scientific talk or what have you. So following up after this webinar, we only have so much time and so much to impart on you. So I guess the question's like, what's next? Well, so first off is we created a handy-dandy guide. This is literally only a few weeks old, so that's exciting, on creating a plain language summary. And it goes over things that we've discussed here, but it's also just a nice, just if you want to print it out, a physical thing to have, but just an actual like guide, quick guide to look at, maybe for you, maybe for your colleagues, whomever. And so this is also one of the handouts you can access via that sidebar, and you can find these on our website and our social media presence, what have you. If you are planning on, if you want to write something that's accessible to reporters or want to work with the media, you can contact us, and by us I mean Lauren and Liza et al. In our press office at news@edu.org, or your PIO, your own public information officer. There's always one in some capacity at your university or maybe your organization, so there's different options there. We didn't really touch on this, but if you're interested in reducing jargon in a really fun way that I will say is not plug and play, there's this thing called the Upgoer 5 text editor. Essentially, it's this little box that you go to this web address, you type in your message, and it'll tell you whether or not the words you've entered are part of the 1,000 most common words in the English language. And actually, it's 1,000 because 1,000, it's not one of those words. But it's a really great way to take incredibly scientific, technical jargon and break it down to beyond its most simplest terms. And so I have to reiterate, this is not plug and play. So this idea that if you come up with a message, chances are that message is not going to be the most, it's not a way we would usually speak in normal conversation, but it can be a really useful tool to think like, oh, I didn't really think that like this word or this context is jargon. And so then maybe if you take a really technical language, you break it down using Upgoer, then coming to somewhere in the middle that is just more conversational and is understandable, but is also not as quote unquote like dumbing it down. Like that's the goal, and that's why Upgoer can be really useful. Unrelated specifically to the plain language summaries, but just for general information, if you all are a student and you're interested in going to our annual meeting in December, we actually have another webinar this week talking about student funding opportunities, so you can find out more information about that. Ways to connect with us. We are all on Twitter. Sharing Science is on Twitter. We do a lot of messaging there. It's not just, I mean, some of it's cute dog photos, but most of it's really what we think is helpful information on science communication, tips, tools, tricks, what have you, the science behind sharing science. We share a lot of these plain language summaries there. So we encourage you to follow us as well as the general AGU account. We also have a podcast. It might seem out of place, but everyone in this room is part of the podcast team, so we like to promote this whenever we can. It's a really good exercise in plain language talking, but also some storytelling from your colleagues and peers. And then finally, if there's anything else that you want to learn or anything you think you've missed today, you can always get in touch with us. You can email us. We're sharingscience@agu.org. You have it's news@agu.org. Or you can go to our website. And then also you can think about joining our Sharing Science community. This is a group of folks who are interested in science communication, policy, and news and outreach, and all types of different things. And it's a community of folks who, we have an online portal, and they can talk to one another, share tips and tools, share experiences, ask for advice, whatever you might want to do within kind of this larger science communication realm. And with that, we'll go to questions.
Yes, and just a reminder, if you have a question, feel free to type it into the questions box and we can get to it. One that we have for Lauren and Liza, and I know you both addressed this to a degree already, but we have a questioner who's a little concerned about superlatives. For reporters, superlatives might be catchy, but for scientists, superlatives might be wrong. We can never be sure that we have fully examined everything.
Yeah, we totally understand that. And so you can just say, for example, you can put a qualifier. You could say likely the biggest, longest, etc. Or we suspect it to be the, deepest, largest something, or largest that we know of, things like that. So you can put those qualifiers in there. And to kind of add on to that, if your results are preliminary, for example, if you're not 100% sure, that's okay too, and just make sure that you mention that.
I also have a question. What if you don't really have your results yet? How do you write your abstract or get the eye of the media under those circumstances?
Yeah, that's okay too. I mean, so we know that many of you, you write your abstract and the submission date is in July or August usually, and you're not presenting until December. And so maybe you haven't run your experiments yet. Maybe you haven't analyzed all your data yet. Maybe you don't know what the numbers are. Maybe you don't know what your result is yet. If that's the case, that's totally okay. We still might be interested in your abstract. Just mention, be really clear about the context and what you're doing in this study, what you expect to find, what you hope to find, and what the implications are. If all the rest of that is there and we can understand why your results might be significant once you have them, then we'll just come back to you. We'll follow up with you. We may reach out to you initially, and then if you don't have your results, it's okay. We'll just follow up with you closer to the meeting when you may have those results ready.
Make it clear that you're still doing the experiments, and that will help us to know how to reach out to you.
I have one that, so someone asked, is there a certain word limit to aim for? It depends on where you're submitting. So I know that AGU journals, for plain language summaries, it's limited to 200 words. It depends on whatever your source might be. I will say kind of more broadly, and this is not just necessarily plain language summaries, but just more plain language communication in general. And this we come across this with the Upgoer 5, that it's not, so being clear and concise doesn't necessarily mean including less words. Sometimes in order to get a message across, the sheer number of words in the, let's say, more plain language message, there might be more words in there because it might take more words to get that message across, or maybe a few words for every one jargon word. So I'd say as a general tip for communication, it's not so important to focus on, am I getting to a certain number of words? But with plain language summaries, it depends on your source, but there may be an actual cutoff just from like a logistics perspective. So just depending on where you're submitting, look for that because there's probably always some sort of guidance there.
Yeah, there's definitely character limits for AGU fall meeting abstract submissions and plain language summaries. I'm not sure what they are off the top of my head, but if you go to the abstract submission pages, it will definitely tell you what that is.
And in fact, we have a similar question along those lines asking, are there any general guidelines to writing an AGU abstract for the fall meeting?
Yes, there are, and we can actually send you a link. There was an EOS article published, I'm not sure when, maybe within the past couple of years, about how to write an abstract, and it basically kind of goes through some of the similar things we talked about here about laying out the context and the methods and the results and all of that, but we can forward that link along to all of you after this webinar is over.
And I will add that we really focused on kind of the plain language components of abstracts here, but a lot of these tips are translatable not only to when we're talking about more kind of broad science communication to broader, let's say, non-science or like out of your field scientists, but a lot of these things can be applied for just general abstracts. So even if you are writing an abstract like for people in your field, your very technical abstract, it's always helpful to just keep some of these things in mind because there is no harm in having an abstract be more understandable.
And having an abstract that more people can understand.
Yeah, exactly. So literally like anyone, whether they're in or out of your field. So a lot of these skills, or a lot of these tips and tools, they translate.
Well, that seems to be the end of our questions at this time. If others arise for you, you can always email us at sharingscience@agu.org, or if you have a specific question related to what you believe is newsworthy science, news@agu.org. And
great.
thank you all for attending.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.